Okay, looks like we have just about 100 people. I know a few more will be joining us as we start, but might as well get things kicked off. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Michael Scharf. I'm the co-dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. And as part of our celebration of Black History Month, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's online event, Breonna Taylor and the Pursuit of Justice. Today, Lonita Baker, counsel for Breonna Taylor and her family, will discuss the case, which has become a national rallying point for racial justice. Together with other highly publicized cases, such as the choking death of George Floyd, the police killing of Breonna Taylor has galvanized a renewed call for police reform across our country. Cleveland has had its own high-profile incidents, such as the 2014 killing of Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old African-American boy who was gunned down by police for playing with a toy gun in a park. And our law school community has experienced its own tragedy as well. In 2016, when Saif al-Alamar, an unarmed Case Western Reserve LLM student from the UAE, was shot and killed by a Hudson police officer after a car accident. Rarely have the police been held to account in these incidents. Our law school has had a long and special interest in racial justice. Some of the country's most impactful civil rights lawyers, such as C.B. King, Fred Gray, and Stephanie Tubbs Jones, are our graduates. And today, we are ranked number 9 in the entire country in public interest law. We know that the effort to make a difference in this area must start within our own walls and our own community. And under the leadership of our Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion, Brian Adamson, we have launched this year a series of initiatives to integrate racial justice more comprehensively into the curriculum, to advocate more effectively for law reform at local and national levels, and to foster a more equitable, inclusive, and welcoming environment in both the law school and in our community. We also know that the effort must be sustained. When the headlines turn to other crises, we must continue to maintain our focus. To that end, we have recently created a race and justice webpage, which includes updates on our initiatives and information about our events, like today's extraordinary presentation by Lonita Baker. I have just been told that there are 184 people registered for today's event, which is terrific. I'd like to thank the co-sponsors of this event, starting with the Case Western Reserve chapter of the Black Law Students Association, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. And as an aside, I'm happy to report that the Case Western Reserve team won the regional Black Law Students Association mock trial competition just last week. Today's presentation is also being co-sponsored by the university's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And finally, the principal co-sponsor is the law school's Social Justice Law Center, under the able direction of Professor Aisha Bell Hardaway, one of the rising stars on our faculty. It's now my pleasure to turn the program over to Professor Hardaway to introduce our speaker. Thank you all.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound
I hope everybody can hear me. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's conversation. The Social Justice Law Center is honored to co-sponsor this event with the Law School's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion under the direction of Associate Dean Brian Adamson, the Black Law Students Association, and the Law School's chapter of the National Lawyers Guild. That video that you just saw is a compilation of photos and the Black National Anthem compiled by the president of our law school's Black Law Students Association, Michaela Hegford. I am moved by the imagery and always love to hear the Black National Anthem. And so on the 17th day of Black History Month, we are grateful for the opportunity to be in conversation with today's speaker, Attorney Lonita Baker. Attorney Baker is a lifelong resident of Louisville, Kentucky, where she attended the University of Louisville as a Porter Achiever Presidential Scholar. She attended the same university for both her law degree and a master's degree in business administration, which she obtained with distinction. Lonita Baker joined Sam Aguilar Injury Lawyers after serving as an assistant Jefferson County attorney for over 6 years. While at the Jefferson County Attorney's Office, she practiced in the Legislative Services Branch of the Civil Division and as a supervising prosecutor in the Criminal Division. Attorney Baker is the current president of the Charles W. Anderson Jr. Bar Association and serves on the National Executive Committee and Board of Governors for the National Bar Association. That's the nation's oldest and largest association of African American lawyers and judges. She also served as Chief of Communications for the NBA under the leadership of past President Benjamin L. Crump. Ms. Baker is currently on the board of directors for the Louisville Bar Association, and she serves as an adjunct professor at the University of Louisville Brandeis School of Law. Attorney Baker has received several awards for her service to the legal profession, including being named a top 40 under 40 attorney by the NBA in 2015 and the National Black Lawyers in 2017, and 2 National Bar Association Presidential Awards. I'm particularly excited, maybe excited isn't the right word, but eager to have this conversation with Attorney Baker in light of the fact that our country witnessed, I think, a level of awareness and eagerness or willingness to engage in conversations around police violence, racial injustice, and how we address those, how we move forward in a way that is just and equitable for Black members of this country. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to be in conversation with you, Ms. Baker. Want to hear your thoughts and your ideas on how we move from the place where we are and find solutions moving forward. For those of you who are attending this, you should know our format for this CLE is going to be a little bit different than others that you've seen before. So Ms. Baker and I are going to have a conversation for about 45 minutes where we learn about what happened to Breonna Taylor, the injustice, Ms. Baker's involvement in that case. And then we're going to turn it over to Michaela Hayford for her to have a conversation with Attorney Baker and ask questions from a student perspective. And then at the end, we will have Q&A, which you all are welcome to pop questions. The general audience is welcome to pop questions in the Q&A. And then Dean Adamson will pose those to Ms. Baker. So it's kind of a three-phase conversation today, and I am ready to get at it. So Ms. Baker, perhaps a good place to start is for you to share with us when you first heard Breonna Taylor's name and how you became involved in seeking justice for her.
Yeah, so I'll go to before I heard Breonna Taylor's name. I did hear this story. Again, being here in Louisville, Kentucky, Breonna was killed on March 13th of last year. That was right at the start of when our state was beginning to close down due to COVID-19. And our office had already begun to work remotely. So that Friday, I'm at work, I'm at home working, and I have the news playing in the background. And I hear a story about a police officer was shot, one suspect dead, one suspect is in custody. It said it was, you know, that they were executing a search warrant, but I didn't think too much more of it because, again, it started with police officer shot and then a suspect dead and you know, executing a search warrant. Being a former prosecutor, I just thought, you know, it was a search warrant gone bad. The next morning, I got a call from Sam Aguiar, who I work with. He was actually in Florida at the time, but he said, hey, you know, the family of the young lady that was killed yesterday would like to meet with us. I'm out of town. Do you mind meeting with them? And I said, sure, you know, I definitely meet with them. Whenever civil rights cases or potential civil rights cases come before me, when I initially meet with the either potential client or the family of the potential client, I don't go in with any expectations. I just go in to hear the story, hear what happened from their perspective of what they know. And so that's exactly, you know, I set up a meeting to meet with Breonna's family the following Monday. They came to my office. It was Breonna's mother, Tamika Palmer, Breonna's sister, Janiyah, and two of Breonna's aunts were in person, and about four were on the phone. You know, it was they have a strong and tightly knit family, and they, you know, I still communicate with all of them. We still have some ongoing things that we're working on for Breonna's case. So from the beginning, they've always been tight knit, and they continue to be that tight knit. So as I'm talking to the family, and they're giving me a picture of Breonna, but then also filling me in. So many people know, and so I have to backtrack a little bit or tell a little bit of the background. The police were looking for Jamarcus Glover, who happens to be an ex-boyfriend of Breonna Taylor's. She was not involved with him at the time of her death. She hadn't spoken with him at all in over a month, and hadn't seen him in even, you know, a longer period of time before March 13th. But so at the same time that police were executing a search warrant at Breonna's apartment, earlier, about 30-45 minutes earlier, they began to execute a search warrant about 20 miles from Breonna's home at Jamarcus's house where he was living. He was apprehended there. He was arrested for trafficking in narcotics. As he was sitting in the police cruiser, he heard something about Springfield, which is the street that Breonna lives on. And so he was kind of like, why are y'all going out there? And he's like, oh, there's like, we know you have stuff out there. Just to clarify, there was no drugs or anything found at Breonna's home. Again, she was not involved with Jamarcus Glover at the time of her death. And Jamarcus has testified to his detriment that, you know, Breonna's never had anything to do with any illegal activity that he was involved in. But he's like, well, why would you all go out there? She doesn't have anything to do with it. And one of the officers at that point commented, oh, it doesn't matter, she's dead. So as he was sitting in the cruiser, he learned that Breonna had already been killed. And so he began, once he was taken to the jail, he began to make phone calls. And I think someone was able to get in touch with someone to get in touch with Breonna's family to at least piece, so they were able to piece together some of the things that led to, even though it's still not fully understandable because she wasn't involved in anything, but at least piecing together what had happened. Again, myself being a former prosecutor, hearing about Breonna, you know, she worked 2 jobs as an ER tech in one hospital, as a PRN at another hospital. You know, her sister lived with her. Her godchild would be at her. Like, it was so much information that the family was giving me that I'm like, this just doesn't add up. And so at that time, so March 13th, within, you know, 5 days, Sam and I decided that we were going to assign this case, investigate it, figure out what happened. And it's still, and at that point is investigate, figure out if there's any lawsuit to be filed. After 2 months of investigation, well, nearly 2 months of investigation, we filed our initial complaint at the end of April. And then a few weeks after we filed our initial complaint, we were trying to get news stations to pick up the story, pick up what we were finding, because again, the pieces were not adding up. The search warrant wasn't adding up. And actually the biggest part of the search warrant, when we first got it, the thing that stood out to me as a former prosecutor were the facts that were contained in the affidavit for the search warrant were over 2 months old. And so in my head, I'm like, this information is stale, like no search warrant should have been given. And so that was the issues that we initially had with the search warrant. Mid-May, attorney Benjamin Crump reached out to me because he had, you know, the family, as we were doing the legal investigation, the family had continued to post on Facebook, post on Instagram, just, this is Breonna Taylor, March 13th, 2020, police entered her home, killing her, you know, and just hoping someone would pick it up. Early to mid-May, people began to talk about Ahmaud Arbery, which actually, you know, he was killed a month before Breonna Taylor. So at that point, Sean King picked up the post, and, you know, if anyone knows anything about Sean King, if he shares it, the whole world, you know, sees it. So Ben Crump, who again, I'm friends with through the National Bar Association, I served as his chief of communications, but, you know, we're really good friends. He reached out and he said, hey, you know, I just read something about this case in Louisville, Kentucky, Breonna Taylor. Do you know anything about it? And I was like, actually, I do. It's my case, you know. So we talk a little bit about it. I don't say anything to him at that moment about whether he may be interested in joining the case or not, because it's not my decision to make solely, but it's Tamika Palmer's decision and Sam Aguiar's decision. But in my head, I thought it was a good idea, just knowing the star power that he can bring. And so when I hung up with him, the first person I called was Sam, and I said, hey, Sam, you know, Ben just called asking about Breonna's case. And he's like, oh, what do you think of bringing him in? I was like, it could be good. Like, we need people to pay attention to it. This is a way. And when I say we need people to pay attention, it's not that like, I don't enjoy being in the media, but I also have several civil rights cases. And I know from working with the city of Louisville that if there's not a microscope or on the case, that that case, like, I have one case that happened in 2018 that we're having our first deposition on, or had our first deposition on today. So it's like, that's what happens with cases when, they're not, they don't have the attention that the city needs to actually move on them. And so Sam thought it was a good idea. Then I talked to Tamika, because at the end of the day, even though I thought it was a good strategy for our case, I can't make the determination if it's a good strategy for the family, because once the media grabs a hold of a case like that, everything the family does is now scrutinized. They're also under a microscope. So I wanted to make sure that the family was okay with that. Tamika didn't immediately say yes. She said, well, let me talk to my family and see, what our thoughts on. So she talked to her family, and then when she called back and said she was agreeable to it, I called Ben back and said, hey, Ben, would you like to join this case with us? And he was interested. We did all of the stuff that we do behind the scenes, the business stuff. And within 3 days of him joining the case, it was a national news story. And I say that to say that's part of the star power that he brings. That, me being an attorney here in Louisville, I do civil rights cases. Ben's been doing this way longer, at least, and even beyond. But, the first case that most people go back to is with Trayvon Martin. And so it's just, so yeah. So that was a long way of me to explain, but hopefully it gave some of the background too that I know we're going to go into.
For sure. So basically your involvement is as a civil rights lawyer filing a wrongful death claim on behalf of her family as a result of what happened on March 13th. Yeah. I wonder if you could talk with us a little bit. You touched on it a bit. If you could talk with us a little bit about the events leading up to that night. I hadn't ever heard that Jamarcus Glover learned in the patrol car that night that Breonna was in fact, that they had killed her. And I wonder if there are other informations or background pieces like that that led the police to her doorstep.
No, I think that what led the police to her doorstep, like, you hate to lump them all, especially being a former prosecutor. Like, I hate, some of the generalizations, but the only way to characterize this is Jamarcus Glover had been arrested 6 times between December and June. So almost every month, December of 2019 to June of 2020. So almost every month between December and June, he was arrested. And most of those were through search warrant. They were by this very same officers. And so it's what I call it, over aggressive officers have zoning in on this target. They wanted him to put him away by any means necessary. And one ploy that we see police officers do in that situation is start to target people around narcotics traffickers. So whether it's the mother, whether it's the girlfriend, his child's mom, because Jamarcus did have a child, and he was with his child's mom at the time that Breonna was killed. So, when I say they weren't together, they really were not together. It's not me as an attorney trying to distance her from him. I've actually talked to Jamarcus a number of times, but for, engaging in narcotics trafficking, for a myriad of reasons that we can go in, but that's a whole nother panel discussion, right? But he's not a bad guy. His neighbors are like, oh, they cut grass for us all the time. Like, they kept it clean over here. They kept people, like, it was very safe when they were on the block. So no, I don't condone drug dealing, but they were not big scary guys, and he didn't have any violent offenses in his history. So it's when they start. So for March 13th, they had actually, the police, the same unit had obtained 6 different search warrants related to Jamarcus Glover. Breonna's just happened to be one of those, because at one point in January of last year, they followed Jamarcus to Breonna's apartment where he picked up an Amazon package. And so I talked a little bit about, the search warrant initially too. They in the search warrant, it says that, they saw him go pick up a package and they confirmed with the Postal Service that he had been receiving suspicious packages. We didn't know that to be false at the time that we filed our lawsuit. But once it became a story and that search warrant was made public, the postal inspector came forward and said, that's a lie.
Wow.
We've never told them that. Louisville Metro Police Department never reached out to us. The only agency, which we later learned was Shapley Police Department, that reached out to us about her address and Jamarcus Glover. We told them that there were no packages going there. So even, where they characterized the package that he picked up being a Postal Service package, we later learned that it was actually an Amazon package, where he had purchased some shoes. And I don't know when he had purchased them, but he had picked it up on that day in January. And so for that day, they, looked up her address, had her name. And again, 2 months, and I say that because in the search warrant, you don't have anything that they saw in February or anything that they saw in March. It's all January. And so once the postal inspector came out and it's like, that's just not true. That's even more ammunition for our civil rights suit. So, but for the lie contained in this search warrant, I don't know that any judge ever would have signed that search warrant, and they never would have been at Breonna's apartment.
So not only was it stale, right, but it was actually deceptive, right? It was false.
Correct.
Do you, so many questions. The first one that I'll ask is, do you have a sense for whether or not Breonna had been surveilled or followed or anything? Had they been keeping tabs on Breonna between January and March?
They had not. And only after, in May, did they begin to go back and pull old video surveillance of not Breonna's apartment, but of Jamarcus. They had put poll cameras out, and they saw her pull up one day, Jamarcus come outside. They talked a little bit and she left. So one day, but they didn't have that until May. So prior to March, they didn't have anything. They did the phone download in March. Again, nothing in her phone incriminating anything. No phone call. Again, that's why I was able to say that she had not even communicated with Jamarcus, in the month preceding her death, because they went back in May to try to say, oh no, she was still, like they tried their best to tarnish. And that's another thing that we see happen with victims of police violence, is they try to tarnish the legacy or the character of the person that they killed. And they definitely tried with Breonna, but you could, timestamp everything. And they didn't get this information until after it became a national story, which infuriated people even more. And I will say, and just to go back to the search warrant a little bit more, the reason we were able to get the financial settlement that we were able to get, one of the primary, not just that she was killed, but they had no way around the lie in the search warrant, and that being the trigger for everything. And so, when we were in negotiations, you could hear him trying to, Kenneth, Breonna's boyfriend at the time that she died, Kenneth Walker fired a shot. He fired a single shot, yeah, but that didn't justify 32 shots. But then it's like, we know we have a problem with the search warrant. So they just kept saying, we know we have a problem with the search warrant. And it's like, yeah, you have a big problem with the search warrant. And so I know that played a large factor in the amount of the settlement.
Yeah, who signed the search warrant? As a foundation question for my next question.
In terms of the officer, or in terms of,
in terms of the officer who filed
the officer that signed the affidavit was Detective Joshua James. He was recently terminated by Louisville Metro Police Department for the lie contained in the search warrant. He was part of the unit. It was the place-based investigation, which was also housed in the criminal interdiction unit. So the place-based investigation unit, they were targeting the area where Jamarcus lived at. So not Breonna's area, but where Jamarcus lived at. That was their place-based. But the criminal interdiction unit included the other officers who executed the search warrant at Breonna's, at Jamarcus Glover's. I will tell you one thing also in listening to the statements of other officers, the SWAT commander who was present at the execution of Jamarcus's search warrant said he had no idea that a different unit was executing a search warrant at Breonna's, and in fact would have told them not to because it was too dangerous to execute so many simultaneous warrants at one time. So it was interesting to know, they did these debriefings, and we saw a wall where, they had all of these addresses, but for some reason, the SWAT commander in charge said, we didn't know about that address. So, there's still so many questions.
Yeah, that's bizarre that the commander in charge wouldn't have, and I don't want to get into administrative investigations, but I really wonder if that led to any additional administrative charges within the department. Could you maybe walk us through, so you meet with Tamika Palmer and her sisters and her daughter, and you make a decision that you and Sam are going to take this case. And before you bring on Attorney Crump, do you have an opportunity to, when do you have an opportunity to go to Breonna's house?
Yeah. So, we went to Breonna's house this Saturday, so 8 days after she had been killed. Her family had the keys to the apartment, so they were able to let us in. Louisville Metro Police had released it, had cleared it, but it was still otherwise the same way that it was, after everything happened on March 13th. When I walked into her apartment it's one of the, there's nothing that can prepare you for walking into that scene. Although I had heard what happened, to walk in and see the amount of bullet holes that I saw and the location of bullet holes, it looked like a complete war zone. And in my head, I'm like, but Kenny only fired one shot, right? So it's like at no time did anyone stop to see, do we need to continue to fire into this unit? Is the threat gone? Based on officers that I've talked to and experts that we talked to, the proper training would have been to immediately retreat as opposed to multiple officers returning fire in the manner that they did. And when I say gunfire, so when you enter into Breonna's apartment, to the right is her living room, and to the left you have the dining room and kitchen, just kind of in the left area. Right, and then left is the dining room and kitchen. The patio doors completely shot out. They had placed, the apartment complex had placed wood boards in place of the glass, but in the curtains that Breonna had on the patio door, you could see multiple bullet holes come through the patio door. You see multiple bullet holes through the wall in the living room, but then you see bullet holes in the dining room table, going through the walls in the dining room, into the cabinets, the dishwasher, the glass on the glass on the oven had been shot, but also the dishwasher had been shot because the water pipe that it was connected to had flooded the carpet right there by the kitchen. Pots had bullet holes, food like Pop-Tarts. So it was like through everything. But then straight down the door is where Breonna was killed. So she was at the back of that hallway. So you have gunfire to the right, left, but she was straight. And so you saw the, pool of blood where she obviously laid and died. You saw bullet holes on the wall there, bullet holes in the bathroom, bullet holes that barely missed a furnace. So it was in the wall in the utility closet next to the furnace, in a toolbox. Breonna's sister's room, Janiyah, had been riddled with bullets. And I said, it's, by God's grace that she was out of town that weekend, or Tamika would have lost both of her daughters. There's no way around that because her room was so shot up, from dressers to mattress to closet. And then Breonna's room, because she had a dresser and mirror that was in front of her window, talk about fire code violation, but that her room had not been touched, except like for ones that went straight through the wall, like straight through, went into her closet, but there was none in the immediate bedroom.
I want to talk a bit about, before we wrap, I want to just put a pin on the conversation around the lack of indictment of the officers for Breonna's killing, just setting that with that stage that you set there for that scene. But before we get there, I really would love for you to share with us as much as you can about, you talked a little bit about the negotiations and them saying, yes, we know we have a problem with the search warrant, but how did you get to a number? Number one, you all resolved this very, very quickly. How did that happen? I know you said star power, but other pieces and parts, if you could share how that happened so quickly and how you got to a number and really what the family was looking for, if you might.
Yeah. So the family could care less about money. It wasn't their primary goal. Their primary goal was to find out what happened to Breonna and for the officers to be held accountable. And so in terms of dollar figure, they didn't care. In terms of how we got to a number, we did our standard, in a civil litigation, wrongful death case, you're going to get an expert to calculate loss of future earnings, the pain of suffering for the time that from when she was first shot to when she died. So we have approximately 6 to 7 minutes there. And then the city says they never, pay punitives, and you don't really, so nothing's characterized as punitive damages, but you do. So, if you had assessed $1 million, $1.5 million to each of the minutes that she was alive, the loss of future wages, the funeral bills, things like that, we got to 12 million. We started high. Now I will say we didn't come down very much from where we started. We looked at markers from prior wrongful deaths, and I don't know, like Breonna Taylor is actually one of the highest individual civil suits against in a wrongful death against a police department or officers in America. It's definitely the largest one in Louisville, Kentucky. The next closest civil rights case being it was not for wrongful death, but it was for a wrongful conviction, was 8.5 million.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the next closest wrongful death in Louisville was about 4.2. So we set the benchmark high there, but what was more important to the family was the reform pieces that we were able to negotiate, which I don't know if it's been done anywhere in the country tied to a settlement, but that was important to the family. And so we made sure that we negotiated it. We didn't pull the reform measures, just out of a box. We talked to, police experts. So people who had a background in actually serving as police, because while we can always say they should do this, they should do that, we're not in that role. So we wanted to make sure it wasn't a situation where this is lawyers telling police how to police. Now there are some things that I could say from a prior, my prior experience as a criminal law practice attorney, but you still want to make sure it's police giving us that advice and guiding us in that way. But important for Ms. Palmer and the rest of Breonna's family is that they could do what they could to prevent future Breonna Taylors from happening. And so that's where we were able to get that. We still want the officers indicted.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that? I will say, just as a form of background, I'm sure that people all over this country, us at Case Western, we are no exception, absolutely outraged, many of us, at the lack of indictment, discouraged. It was a tough, a tough time
Yeah.
period for sure. And our students have been actively engaged in this work. It's, I think, why Dean Addison thought it was so important for you to be with us today. And they have, staged their own levels of protest to draw attention to the nonsense that was the non-indictments in the case, or in the indictment for individuals that weren't actually harmed. Can you talk a little bit about the criminal process, especially considering the fact that you do have the prosecutor background, and why it seems to be so hard, at least it was in Louisville, right, for this very high profile case, right, for there not to be an indictment on behalf of Breonna or Kenneth Walker?
Yeah. So what we learned from talking and hearing from the grand jurors is they would have indicted. Daniel Cameron, the Attorney General for Kentucky, refused to present charges on behalf of Breonna to the grand jury, but the grand jury was ready to indict and were upset that they were not able to indict. And this is one of the few cases ever where you've gotten to get the entire grand jury transcript, and where the judge permitted grand jurors who wish to come forward and talk about it. So we've gotten a very unique perspective. The thing that bothered me, well, a lot of things bothered me about the way that Daniel Cameron treated the grand jury process. But the thing that bothered me most was when he met with Tamika Palmer before his press conference announcing the results of the grand jury process. He never once told her that, one, the wanton endangerment charges that Brett Hankinson was indicted for did not involve Breonna Taylor. Two, he made it and presented it to her and later America, but most importantly to her, as this was the grand jury's decision not to indict anyone for anything more serious. We now know and learned soon after that that was not the truth. I think for our criminal justice system to truly work, prosecutors have to be able to detach themselves from those situations. We have a grand jury process for a reason. If you allow, like we've seen, if they had allowed the grand jury to do what it's tasked with doing, what our statutes tell it to do, they would have come to the right situation. Me also, as a former prosecutor, had the evidence been presented in an unbiased manner, and the grand jury made the decision not to indict the officers, it would have been hard for me to accept, but I would have been more understanding of it because at least the system worked the way that it was supposed to work. One thing I always push to people, and especially while I have captive law student audience, we have to have more justice-minded people become prosecutors. The default is always to go into a defense, and I started my career as a public defender, but it's always to, let's be a public defender, let's do criminal defense, let's work for the ACLU or the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So it's always and of course we need more civil rights plaintiffs attorneys, but we need more to be prosecutors because prosecutors are the gatekeepers of justice. They are, to me, they have the most, they are in the best position to make police officers to do their job the way that they're supposed to not violate individual rights, to truly investigate a case versus, taking the easy ways to get search warrants. And so I just think we need more prosecutors.
So I'm gonna push just a little bit. I was gonna try to avoid this, but right. So Daniel Cameron is a Black man. Daniel Cameron is not a Jefferson County prosecutor. He is the state attorney general, right? Aside of it being federal charges, you don't get any further removed from the Louisville Police Department than that, right? And he's supposed to be on the side of justice, right? And so all of the ducks are in a row, it would seem, right? What?
You have to know a little. I'm gonna cause you have to know a little bit about Daniel Cameron and his background too.
Yep.
He's not a justice-minded person. He's a politician, and that's the sad thing about when we get to top prosecutors. They are political offices, but he's a politician. He's never once tried a single case, civil or criminal. He misstated the law in his press conference in further interviews. So he's not even taking the time to learn the least bit about criminal law. He's endorsed by the Fraternal Order Police everywhere in the state. And so, it goes to, I think, one, there's an issue when we're having top prosecutors ask for FOP endorsements. So that's a conflict of interest, ways we maybe need to have some campaign reform. So all of it does come back to politics. But so I push back in saying that Daniel Cameron is not really that justice-minded person that I'm talking about we need as prosecutors. He's a politician. Like this, people see this position as his stepping stone to, whether it's governor or whether it's U.S. senator. Like he has higher political aspirations, not in being, a gatekeeper of justice.
Yeah. And when we think about accountability, I'm always trying, right? We say that word and then trying to understand exactly what the intricate details are of accountability. It is so hard to say, right? We need special prosecutors, or we need the state to take over these investigations for the reasons that you have so aptly identified. So I have 10 more minutes, and I'm trying to be a good steward of my time. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the reforms that you got, if community pushes or leaders who were active around calling attention to Breonna's killing, how that played into some of the settlement negotiations that you were able to get, and then the ones that if there were any that took place outside of the settlement negotiations.
Yeah, so the city of Louisville passed Breonna's law, and that was before our settlement. Breonna's law banned no-knock warrants, a complete ban on no-knock warrants in the city of Louisville, which is all they have the authority to implement that ordinance for. But it also requires police officers to turn on their body camera 5 minutes before the execution of a search warrant, and they can't turn it off until 5 minutes after the search warrant is completely executed. So they're completely finished with the execution of the search warrant. So that was good, because here, we have officers that had body cameras on, but they did not turn them, not on. They had them on them, but they didn't turn them on. So, and there are penalties within the Breonna's law if they don't turn them on. So I do think that that's one of those things that we need body camera. Like we've seen from everything from George Floyd to Ahmaud Arbery to, with Breonna Taylor not having body camera. Body camera is another, like prosecutors are gatekeepers. Body camera is going to be one of those gatekeepers, not just for the protection of citizens, but it's also there to protect officers for wrongful allegations, right? So I don't know what the problem with turning on body camera is, but it should be there. The protests definitely played a huge role in our ability to settle the case as quickly as we did, as well as in the reform, and also making the city amenable to reform. One thing I learned quickly about my city is they don't like being under a microscope. And I think initially they thought, it's in the national news, but it'll go away. But in June, it didn't go away. In July, the 87 people were arrested on Daniel Cameron's lawn. So it's, they're doing some stuff in Louisville. So the camera still didn't go away. There's nothing else to pay attention to. We didn't have any sports. We didn't have, it's COVID. And so I commend and I represent many of the protesters, because I'm like, I wouldn't have been able to have the success that I had without them out there. So I do represent a lot of the protesters pro bono, as well as many other attorneys in our city are representing because a lot of people have been arrested. You know, they don't talk about that a lot, but a lot have been arrested. So, but when the cameras didn't go away in July, they didn't go away in August and September. After the grand jury, they still didn't so. And I think part of it was also the reason it was as quickly as it was. I do think there was some part of the city hoping that if we do our part and settle the civil side, which is what we have control over, maybe we can soften the brunt of the protesters. Like if they want to, like they really didn't know, are people going to burn stuff? I'm like, I don't know if they're going to burn it. I don't want them to burn stuff down, but I'm not a protester. I'm the attorney. Like, you know, I'm at home watching it like you are. So, but you know, they really didn't have a clue of what was going to happen. So I do think there was some sense of trying to soften any blowback if Daniel Cameron didn't indict the officers. And I say that knowing like our mayor and our city government is more democratic than our state. Our state's very Republican. Daniel Cameron's a Republican. So it's not like they were having conversations. Mm-hmm. The mayor kept trying to get, hey, when do you think you'll have an indictment? Because at one point and over the summer, I have my theories of who was, you know, leaking information, but every week it was, oh, the grand jury decision's coming down. No one's going to be indicted. And protesters would get riled up. So it was like every week it was like, calm down, you know, we don't have any news. They said they'll let Miss Palmer know first. We haven't heard anything. Yeah. And so we walked around a whole summer, you know, kind of like on eggshells, like what's going to happen? When is it going to happen? Like no one's knowing. And so I do think that part of the settlement and with the protests, it was like, okay, we don't want to give you this much money, but we want this to be done before he does something stupid and they burn our city.
Well, that's just a really interesting. I mean, the power of the protest, right? For some people, that's still a debatable fact. I think your story shows that it isn't. And it also really illuminates for me, or makes me continue to wonder, why not just do the right thing in the first place? Why not just do the right thing in the first place instead of trying to manage whether or not there are going to be protests, instead of trying to figure out what's going to be the right amount to make people, as you said, Ms. Palmer does not care about money, right? How do we actually institute reforms that will make sure that we don't have to revisit this tragedy again, right? This loss of life again. I think that's really, really important and impactful. I don't know. I hope Michaela is around. Michaela, are you there? There she is.
Yes.
So I'm going to turn the Q&A over to Michaela. You, I think, dropped some really nice nuggets that Michaela may want to pick up on in the conversation from a student perspective. And I'm going to go off of camera at this point and let you all have your conversation.
Thank you.
Sounds good. So we had a lot of questions from students about the public facing kind of parts of the case. But I think the first question I want to ask is this task of humanizing Breonna Taylor. And obviously it shouldn't have to be this way, but from what you were saying earlier, the initial stories were calling her a suspect in this case. And so I'm wondering about the strategy involved in humanizing Breonna.
Yeah, it was really easy for us to humanize Breonna because she's such a great person. Like it's one of the, I tell people, like, I hate that I had to meet her through her family, but through this process, I feel like Breonna and I are old friends. I think we kind of, we're soul sisters. Like I see pictures of Breonna, I'm like, look. So, and even through the slideshow that you put together, Michaela, you see her smile, like she's so full of life. You see, she's always with people, with her sister, with her mom. Um, we always say like she's the diva. She's like, I'm gonna be fly. And we laugh because when she got her EMT certificate, like I asked her mom, I was like, Breonna probably would hate that picture is like, but that was one of the first ones, when she's at her graduation with the flowers. I was like, because when you look at all of the other pictures and she's so done up, this one's like, I'm here for my EMT graduation. I can't be dolled up, but I'm in the uniform. And her mom's like, she would hate that picture's going around. But again, that was part of the um, having to let people know that she was a first responder, so she's certified EMT. She worked in an emergency room. There's once news came out about more news and the stations really started to play stories on Breonna, you have former patients coming forward talking about how she truly helped them through rehab, it like from physical injuries. So you get to see that she really is the helper. She likes to play games with family. She was the person that made sure that everyone got together on holidays. And so when it's someone so lovable, it's easy to humanize them. And so our job was, Breonna made our job easy in that area.
Thank you. The next question is about how you prepare yourself, and then also how do you prepare the client's family for some of this heightened scrutiny in the media?
Yeah. So myself, this is by far the hardest case that I've had to work on professionally, because one thing with Breonna is I think that the thing that hit home for most of us is we are Breonna in some aspect. We could easily be at home at 12:40 in the morning asleep, someone busting our door, and you're like, what in the world? No, like it could happen to anyone. I also have a daughter who is just 2 years younger than Breonna, and so it really hit home, like simply because of someone this could happen to you and you don't have to be doing anything wrong. So emotionally it was really hard, and being a Black woman, um, I had my able co-counsel, but I don't think they understood, like, me being a Black woman telling Breonna's story relating to my daughter being so close in age. Like there were days that I was just like, I can't do this. Like I would sit in the house and cry because it was just so much emotion to bear. But at the end of the day, you have to suck it up and do fight for your client, which was the family of Breonna Taylor. And preparing Breonna's family, especially her mom. Her mom, Tamika, hates TV. She hates interviews. But she also realized that she had to tell her story to, like, her goal was again to prevent what happened to Breonna from happening to other people. So she had to put herself out there and be willing to tell the story of Breonna. And then when she finally got to that point, she said, you know what? This isn't about me. She's like, I have to fight for my baby. Breonna would do it for me. So I just have to suck it up and deal with it. Again, she's a very private person. So not much media wise, and I learned early, like initially when we would start with interviews, Ben Crump, who is, more accustomed to interviewing, doing the television, would try to prep her, hey, here's talking points that tick to this, da, da, da. And I could see her like tense up. Well, one day it was just her and I doing the interview, and I'm like, I'm gonna like let her do what she wants to do. And when she just spoke from her heart, I was like, this is what we have to do. Like, we don't need to give her talking points. This is her daughter, her family, her story. Let her tell her story. Now for lawyers, of course, I got to write down my talking points to make sure I stay on track and say what needs to be said. So media cases though, my overall goal with the media was just to make sure that I was always honest. People had to trust what I was saying to be accurate. And with what happened to Breonna, it was so horrendous in and of itself that there was no need for me to embellish anything. And I didn't want to do that because I wanted, anytime that I spoke, I wanted people to be like, well, Anita said this, and so that must be it. You know what I mean? So I hope that makes sense. But I just really wanted people to know that I was honest, upfront, truthful about everything, so that my credibility went a long way. And so it was my word versus someone else's word. They were going to believe me.
And just speaking as a law student, I think what you were saying about just identifying with Breonna Taylor, you know, I think so many people and so many of the Black women who are law students here, of course, identify with her. And I would say now having you here and seeing you as her attorney, and you're a Black woman, like we have another person to identify with in this story. And you know, just really appreciate you being in that role, and want you to realize that you've had that impact on me and probably so many others.
Thank you. Thank you.
So the next question is just about finding your way as an attorney, and how you did that. And also if you can provide any advice for the students here in terms of finding our way and finding our practice area where we're going to make a difference, hopefully.
So one thing that piece of advice I would give you is to make sure you're happy. The practice of law itself can be a stressful job. It's meant to be a stressful job, but you don't want it to be so stressful that you lose yourself in it. I've been lucky enough that I've loved every legal job that I had. As I stated earlier, I started out as a public defender. I love the work I did as a public defender. And I love the training that I got at the public defender's office. I didn't like the politics that were going on at the public defender's office that I worked with. So I was there for 2 years, and I was like, you know what? Gotta go. Because it's one thing to go get beat up in court, you know, because of your clients are charged with some of the most heinous crimes, you know, out there, but they still deserve, you know, the utmost vigorous defense. And then to come back to the office and just be subject to those politics. That's not every public defender's office. That was my experience, my office. So I'm not saying that to discourage anyone from being public defenders. I'm saying it to say you may like your job, but if the environment is not healthy for you, don't stay in a situation that's unhealthy for you. I did private practice for a little bit with one of my good friends. When she moved to Georgia, I was still here. That's when I became a prosecutor. I absolutely loved being a prosecutor because I said, you know, it's kind of the gatekeeper of justice. My goal as a prosecutor was what resources can I give to people so that they don't keep coming back into my courtroom? I wanted to close the revolving door. And you do that through resources, not through incarcerated individuals. So that's kind of the way that I prosecuted. And my boss was okay with it. He said, long as you have a reason of why you're doing it, you know, I'm okay with it. Then I got, after 6 years of, 5.5 years as prosecutor, I was getting kind of bored. That kind of happens. I was like, need a new challenge. So my office also handled the civil stuff for the city. So I moved to the civil division where I advised Metro Council. That's how I knew about the ordinances, drafting ordinances. I was like, hey, why don't we do a Breonna's Law with the city? If it may take us too long to get it through the state, but it came from that prior experience. That was okay, but I missed being in the courtroom, which is why I then started doing civil litigation. It's easy in law to get lured by money. There are a lot of jobs that don't pay. They're like that. I don't know where, because for most of my career, I was like, okay, I don't know how I'm going to make it, but I enjoyed what I was doing. And then you have to, like, what I don't want people to do is trade off the money for their own healthiness. So, you know, they're at least here, and I don't know if it's the same in Ohio, the suicide rate, and I hate to go dark, but the suicide, you asked about finding, you know, so I want to give you all of that information, but the suicide rate among lawyers is very high. One of the highest professions in our state. And it's just, I don't see myself doing that because I love doing what I'm doing, but I also make sure that I put myself first. And so the greatest advice that I can give everyone is to always put yourself first above any job, and just always continue to circle back. And if you have to do that 6-month check-in to make sure you're still okay, have a good support system. I'm very active. I'm the vice president for the National Bar Association right now. I love my network, so I have friends all over the country. So we still, not as much now because of COVID, but we would travel and hang out and just have fun and be ourselves. And when I say we travel, like, we'll rent a house and just sit in the house the whole weekend, but have fun, because you need people that you can truly vent to and understand what you're going through, if that makes sense. So I hope that helps.
Yeah.
And if like any student that would like to reach out to me at any time, I give the deans permission to share my contact information. I'm a resource. When you find resources, use them.
Thank you. I will hand it off to Dean Adamson so that any of the participants that have questions, that those can be asked. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, Ms. Baker. Thank you for that insightful education, and thank you for your experience and the gifts that you've brought to the family, and the healing that you've allowed to give, to offer to the family as well as the community, and sharing your time with us. There's a few questions in the queue, so I'll just go to them. One question is, was there any sort of admission of negligence or the like with the settlement agreement, in the settlement agreement?
There was not any admission of negligence in the settlement agreement. In fact, they say this is not an admission, which is typical. But
okay, all right. Yeah.
$12 million is
12 million. That's an admission of sorts. That's right. That's right. Here's a second question. Bear with me for a moment. Context of no-knock warrants. What is the criminal procedure? Context, exigent circumstances, and what is the emergency aid doctrine? This question goes on. What are exceptions to the Fourth Amendment? What is a search in good faith reliance on a warrant? What does that mean? And what does it mean if police officers have done everything reasonable to comply with Fourth Amendment requirements? How is this determined that the police did not act in good faith? In wrongful death, are police granted qualified immunity? Several different questions embedded in there, but it all has the thread of constitutional issues, procedural issues regarding search warrants and qualified immunity. Yeah.
So I think in overall, what the question may be getting to is, since a different officer actually did the affidavit for the search warrant than those that executed. So he was not present at the execution of the search warrant. Different officers were, so they didn't, or maybe did not know about the lie contained in the search warrant. So their reliance on the search warrant because it was granted by the judge. The thing about it, though, is that 2 of the officers who executed the search warrant are 2 of the officers who were identified later by Shavli Police Department as being the officers who asked about the suspicious packages from the post office.
Okay.
And they were told there were no packages going. So they would have relayed the information to Joshua James, who sought the search warrant. So they did have some knowledge of it, of the search warrant and the misinformation in the search warrant.
Yeah. I think maybe you answered this earlier, but if you have anything to add, please do. What were some of the reforms that the police department agreed to in the settlement?
Yeah, so we broke them down into into 3 different categories. So one was search warrant reform. Another one was more community-based reform. And the third was accountability, so officer accountability reforms. Some of the things that were in the community-based reform, we always hear about, community policing, and initiatives there. So it was to, one, have give an incentive for officers to live within the communities that they patrol. You can't force them to, but if they do, incentivize the officers that choose to do so. One of the others were to give officers the opportunity to volunteer within their community, and they could do that using their paid. So like 2 hours per week while they're on shift to volunteer with a little league team, something that, a nonprofit within their patrol district, so that they get to know the people in their patrol district outside of when they want to arrest them. And then under the officer accountability is keeping track of their records, the disciplinary records, their citizen complaints. What we learned here is that one of the officers involved in the murder of Breonna Taylor had been accused by multiple women of sexually assaulting them when they left a bar. Well, because PSU didn't substantiate those, they disappeared. So victim one, hers was, deleted from the system once it was not substantiated. When victim two came forward, there was no evidence that the investigator of victim one's that the investigator for victim two could look at. But one allegation may not be true, but once you get to 5, and I think by the time we finished, we were up to 10 females that had the same exact story. But so one may not be, but if they had the ability to look at the prior ones, they would have seen that there was a pattern there.
Absolutely.
So it was to keep track of those records and things like that. Creating the Inspector General's office to actually investigate cases of officer wrongdoing. And then some of the search warrant procedures was not a major, but a supervising commanding officer has to sign off before you could go see a judge was one of the main things.
Okay, all right, yeah. So 3 broad categories around search warrant reform, community policing, and community involvement, and then accountability.
Yeah, and one of the big ones on community too was to hire social workers to go out on some runs, because that's one of the things that we've been talking about under the defunding arguments, but we didn't talk defund anything, but we said hire a social worker. And actually, we didn't want them to hire them because we didn't want the social workers to be employed by LMPD so that they can have, not have that conflict. So they have to actually contract with an outside company to provide social workers to be able to be dispatched on certain calls.
Yeah, absolutely. I see that. Excellent idea. I was just reading about the Charlena Lyles case in Seattle again, and it brought the whole idea of reform in terms of mental health needs to light again, painfully. So thank you for that. The next question, and we have maybe time for 1 or 2 more questions, if anyone cares to ask. Are you a member of a Women's Bar Association?
I'm not a member of the Women's Bar Association. I'm very active in our local Louisville Bar Association, but also as the National Bar Association. But I am not a member of any women's bar associations.
Okay, great. Okay. All right. Another question. Was qualified immunity at issue here? Can you touch on this and how it relates to police violence against people of color? Is there any legislation currently being brought forward in your state to stop the doctrine of qualified immunity?
So qualified immunity is one of those, Sam and I like to say, it's just one of the most misunderstood legal doctrines. So there are, the city's always going to argue qualified immunity. They didn't even, normally that's the first thing they file. They did not in this case. And I think, again, with that wrongdoing in the search warrant, you have a lot of issues there. Like qualified immunity is not going to protect you from something like that. Also, when there's a pattern of practices issue with policies of a department or procedures of a department violating a known right, then they don't get over that hump of qualified immunity. Right. Currently pending nationally is the George Floyd Police Accountability Act, which does have some measures in it to limit qualified immunity. That's where, so we could say statewide legislation, our state's not the issue in terms of, because we have the regular negligence standard here. And of course, when you say negligence, the reasonable is measured from a reasonable police officer, but it's still negligence nonetheless. But where we normally run into issues with qualified immunity is when we're in federal court. And so if that George Floyd Police Accountability Act gets passed, then we'll have some change there.
All right. Thank you for that response. Another question: what is your advice to justice-minded people in using their voices, especially as young lawyers in old systems? For example, prosecutors. The fact that I think it maybe strikes some people. It strikes some people that you were a prosecutor, but you couched and framed it really well in terms of having a certain type of prosecutor is critically important to our society because they're the gatekeepers. So this question asks, what's your advice to justice-minded people in using their voices, especially as young lawyers in those systems?
I think we have to do it. So many times we avoid them, but when you look at prosecutors, and I'm going to go to the ones that I know, and I wish I could name a non-Black woman off the top of my head, but I know the Black woman. But when you look at a Marilyn Mosby, who has no problem indicting and charging police officers when she thinks it's the right thing to do, whether or not a jury convicts is a different thing, but she doesn't make any, qualms about charging them. Kim Foxx in Chicago, she will charge the officers as well. So the thing is, we just have to do it. We have to put ourselves in those roles. And if we continue to stay away from those roles, then we continue to allow the same people who have been operating the way that it's been operating for hundreds of years, it's going to continue to operate in that manner. So until, it all goes back to politics, we really do have to be willing to run for offices, work in those political offices, even if we're not the elected person, but work in those political offices and be willing to make a change. And so that also comes with voting too. I know sometimes I really get discouraged when I hear a lot of young people saying, what's the use in voting? It doesn't change anything. Well, that's the way we change. Yeah. And most of the time it's always primary elections. Like here in Louisville, it's always going to be your primary elections because we're so heavily a Democratic city. So it's primary elections that count. So that's when you have to pay attention to who's running and what their platforms are. If you wait to November, you're kind of too late. But
I see. Yeah, I think we have time for these last two questions. Most call what happened to Breonna a murder, quote unquote, a murder. How is the city and the police department referring to the incident? How are they referring to the incident?
Police department itself as a whole has been quiet, but I will tell you, they terminated Joshua James for the lie on the search warrant, Brett Hankinson for recklessly firing into the apartment, and eventually Miles Cosgrove, who was fired in the last month, also for recklessly firing into Breonna's home, which is what we always maintained was the grounds by which an indictment was proper. And for wanton murder, it's when you have a reckless disregard for the safety of individuals. Breonna Taylor is an innocent person who was killed because officers fired recklessly over 32 shots into her apartment in response to one. They did not have any target as displayed, when I talk about bullets in pots, pans, food, early missing the furnace, what if they hit the furnace and blew the entire 8-unit building up? It's you just can't encourage behavior like that. This was not the Wild Wild West. These were people. So I characterize it as a murder. In Kentucky, we have wanton murder, and until a jury says they're not guilty of it, I will continue to characterize it as
that. This last question says hello and thank you. Have the officers been indicted? What do you think the process of accountability could have looked like? What further barriers to accountability existed in this case?
So I won't go into what I think it would like full accountability will look like, because we're still pushing for an indictment. And so one thing I always try to inform people is jeopardy has not attached to any of these officers because they've not been charged with anything as it relates to Breonna Taylor. And in Kentucky, we don't have a statute of limitations for felonies. So it could be when we have a justice-minded prosecutor in office that these officers get indicted, years later. But we are continuing to push for that change. So we're not done yet.
Well, that's good to know, but that's also sad, right? But
Yeah.
That's great to know. Thank you again, Ms. Baker. I'm going to return the program to Professor Hardaway, Director Hardaway, to close us out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Attorney Baker, for your time with us today. Thank you, Dean Adamson. Thank you, Michaela, for your participation as well.